So I dedicate a lot of this channel to the marathon distance. In fact, I was going through and saw that I haven't done very many videos on the channel since I started dedicated to the half marathon distance. Well, recently I did a video about how important it is to use effort as your number one guide, or your North Star, I called it, in the marathon. And I had a couple people specifically ask if I could translate to the half marathon, or ask what would pacing or effort-based strategy look like for the half marathon. So that's what this video is about. And the reality is I coach many runners who are training for the marathon distance, but those same athletes are also training for the half marathon. And also I have people come to me asking specifically to get trained for the half marathon or get a customized training plan written for them for the half marathon. So it only makes sense that we touch on this topic. So in this particular video, we're gonna talk about half marathon pacing as a whole. I'm gonna talk about what that looks like of balancing pace versus effort, just kind of general guidelines. And I'll have an opportunity for you guys to download a written out strategy that also talks about fueling and other tips if you guys want to download that to get you ready for your next half marathon. So first I want to start with my 3 main pacing tips when it comes to the half marathon, and then we'll get into specifically how I break up the half marathon, how many parts, and what that should look like when you're trying to determine what effort or what pace you should be utilizing for each of those sections. So number 1 is effort should be your number 1 guide. So what I see too often is athletes getting hyper fixated on pace. This usually revolves around a goal time. So let's just say that athlete wants to get a 2-hour half marathon. They often become very fixated on wanting this goal, whether it's the right goal or not. They know that that 2-hour marathon equates to a 9:09 per mile pace. And so that's what they know they need to maintain during the whole half marathon in order to get it. In reality, you should actually be fluctuating that pace. It shouldn't be the same all the time. The problem with being really fixated on a pace like that is the runner is then not focused on how they are feeling. If they're really obsessed with just the time, they're more looking at their watch and am I over? Am I under? Okay, I'm going faster, yay, or I'm well behind, oh no, I have to hurry up, without really taking stock in how that pace translates to how they're feeling during their race. So why is effort so important? Well, when we think about particular race courses, they're not all the same. They're not all going to have perfect weather and be completely flat, and you're not always going to show up feeling your absolute best. That's just the reality, no matter how well trained you are. And that's another factor as well, is I think a lot of athletes just have this time in their mind that they want, even though they're not ready for it, or perhaps their training didn't go as well as they had hoped that it would, and so they're actually not ready for that particular time. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that can't be the goal for the day, especially if maybe they're close but unsure, but really you should be using effort as your guide. So effort is more important than pace, and it's really important that you practice this in training so that when you show up on race day, you're very ready to match that pace and what effort that is and what that feels like, so that you know when you need to adjust the pace if needed to pull back to your effort. Number 2 is piggybacking off of number 1, and that's that you should focus on even effort over even pace. So instead of focusing on keeping a steady pace throughout, it's better to have a variance based on what the course throws at you. So one example of this would be a hilly course. So you have a course that has quite a few hills and isn't really flat, and you're gonna end up seeing a lot of those. And I'll say, a lot of newer athletes don't even really look at the course ahead of time, so maybe aren't as familiar with this. So that is one tip right there too, is be very aware of what the course looks like, where those hills are going to be. So when I talk about even effort, this is what it means, is that your effort should be about the same up the hill as it is down the hill, as it is on the flat portions of the race. And so what that means is that you have to go slower on the uphills in order to match that effort to the downhill or the flat. So slower on the ups, faster on the downs, and obviously more even or more at that goal pace or goal effort on those flats. So that's what makes the most sense. If you try to go hard up that hill, which is what I see other runners doing a lot, they are overexerting themselves, and then they're very winded when they get top of the hill. They've used up all their energy just trying to maintain a pace up the hill, and the people who've done a really good job of maintaining even effort end up passing them on the downhills and it comes back to bite them later and they end up with a worse time. So even effort is super important. This also is a good strategy to maintain when it's windy, especially if you know you're going to get to turn around. You can't do it as much if it's a point to point and you're either having a tailwind the whole time or headwind the whole time, but a lot of courses turn, and so if you know you're going to be in a headwind, you really need to pull back on the pace. Otherwise, it just really zaps your energy. Wind can be really difficult, so if you slow down and if you know you're going to get to turn around, then you get to use the tailwind to your advantage once you turn around. So that would be what I'm referring to as even effort. And number 3 is don't bank time. So unfortunately, this is a really common strategy that I see that's really not a strategy. It's actually a recipe for disaster and going to put you in a position to have a much worse time. Often ends up means people are walking towards the end because they used up all of their energy perhaps in those first 10, 11 miles, and then they don't have anything left to really go for it in those last couple miles. And so that's what's happening when you're banking time. So instead you want to flip it and think about banking energy, which actually means you're gonna go slower in the beginning so that you can go faster at the end. What I find is that runners have a really hard time trusting this strategy, trusting this thought process. But I've coached many runners, and I see when the athlete really trusts this strategy and they follow the guidelines that I give them for pacing and for effort, they end up with an incredible race and they learn that they can negative split, and it just helps everything going forward in their races after that as well. So negative splits in the half marathon distance is the goal. At the very least, you're looking for even splits. So negative splits would be where the first half is slower than the second half. Even splits would essentially be that the first half is about the same as the second half. And sometimes, especially when you're a little bit newer, the second half ends up slightly slower in the first half. That's not that big of a deal either. We're just trying to find that right pace for you based on what your experience is, what your training looks like, what you're ready for, so that you're not having a much slower back half, which is what we would call positive split. So the more inexperienced or unsure you are, the slower you should start. That's not a problem, and then you can build from there. So we'll talk about that pacing in just a minute, but a quick little story is I had an injury in 2022, a foot injury that I was working through. I'd been cleared by my PT to run, but I wasn't really doing any speed work. I had quite a bit of volume, but I had a half marathon on my calendar that I had planned well in advance. I was still going to do it, but I just really didn't have any idea of what I was capable of. So I was much more conservative going into that race. It ended up being an incredibly strong race. I think that my first mile was about 45 seconds slower per mile than my last mile, which isn't what I would have typically done or what I would typically recommend, but I was very unsure at the time of what I was capable of, and I actually ended up having an incredible race. I was only 1 minute off of my PR, so no, it wasn't a PR day like I would have originally wanted, but based off my training, it was exactly what I needed on the day. It all went really well. And that's what I would recommend to people, is that you want to focus on having a really strong race first, learning to run the distance strong, and then you can focus on getting those PRs once you really understand how to navigate the distance. It's gonna help you long term. So next, how do I break up the half marathon? So for my athletes, I typically break the half marathon distance into 3 parts. So we talk about both RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, as well as pace, so they have an understanding of about where they should be in which section based on both. So when I'm talking about rate of perceived exertion, that's a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 is basically being close to sedentary or just very slow movement, all the way up to 10, which is your absolute max effort, max heart rate, as fast as you possibly go. So miles 1 and 2, you want to be focused on rate of perceived exertion 4 to 5 out of 10, with a speed limit of about 10 to 15 seconds slower per mile than your half marathon goal pace. And figuring out that goal pace is a whole other video that I can do, but let's just say you know what your goal pace is, you feel confident in that goal pace, you're running about 10 to 15 seconds slower than that so that you can start conservatively and have a strong race. So this is going back to that don't bank time, instead we want to bank energy. You are easing in, you're just kind of getting your bearings, you're just getting ready for the race that's about to come at you. You don't want to get caught up in the excitement of race day. That's where people have a really challenging time with this. You also don't want to be weaving in and out a lot because we know a lot of these races can be crowded in the beginning. They usually break up. So just relax and just know it's okay that you're going a little bit slower than your goal pace. You're going to get to make up that time later. You're also going to see those other runners later when you pass them because you are very controlled in your race strategy, whereas a lot of them are probably starting way too fast, unfortunately. All right, moving into miles 3 through 9. This is where you're getting into goal pace, but not right away. So you want to be starting here at about 5 to 10 seconds slower per mile than goal pace when we're in that mile 3, mile 4, and you're moving then into goal pace for the majority of those miles, and then towards the later ones, so like 8 and 9, you're focusing on getting to be about 5 seconds per mile faster than goal pace. As far as RPE here, you're moving into about 5 to 7, so it's going to feel very controlled when you get into mile 3. It should still feel very easy as you're moving into this section. If it doesn't, that is your cue to back off. As you get towards the later miles in this section, so 7 through 9, it is going to start getting uncomfortable, but it should still feel doable. And you should be constantly asking yourself, can I continue at this pace to the very end? Do I know that I can at least hold this pace if I weren't to get any faster? If the answer to that is no, then you need to back off, at least for that mile. And then if you start to feel better, you can bump it up again in the next mile. But if you are paying attention to effort, paying attention to how you feel, like we talked about earlier, if it feels too challenging, too hard, too early, especially if we're talking like before you're even at the halfway point for the half marathon, then you need to pull back. I promise it's only going to help you. Don't try to just keep pushing a pace that you know in your mind you're not ready for. And so the last section, so section 3, is that last 5K or miles 10 through the finish line of 13.1. So this rate of perceived exertion is going to be about 7 to 10. So you're maybe coming in at that 7, which is like borderline comfortable, uncomfortable. You're definitely getting into that uncomfortable as you don't know how long you're gonna be there, and it's going to get really challenging after that. And the goal here is that you're running faster than goal pace. But like I tell my athletes, sometimes you get here and you realize that you weren't ready for faster than goal pace, and you don't really need to be looking at your watch that much at this point anyway. You can glance at it maybe as you're coming through mile 10, maybe 11, just to get a gauge of where you're at. But really, this is very effort-based at this point anyway, because whereas we were being very conservative in the beginning and being very controlled in the middle, now you're putting it all on the line. So this is where you know that it's going to get very hard, very challenging, and this is where your mindset work is really going to come into play. So having those mantras, having something to really focus on outside of the pain that you're feeling. And I have other videos about mindset that really aren't just focused on the marathon distance. They can be used for any of these distances. So I'll make sure I link those below because that gets very helpful in these last miles when you want to quit. Everything in your body is saying, slow down. I don't want to do this anymore. This is really hard. That you have to overcome in your mind, because we know that the mind gives up before the body does. And telling yourself that you're stronger than you think that you are. You're capable of more than you think, and you can do hard things. So when we're thinking about this section broken up, obviously 3 miles is still a good distance to go. So just be smart in especially that first mile of the section. And then once you have 2 to go, you're really pushing it, pedal to the gas as fast as you can go. Whatever that ends up being, so that you cross the finish line knowing you gave it your all, you gave it your best, you didn't feel like you had anything left in the tank, and that's all you can do. I have a strategy where I like to ask myself during these really hard miles, is this the best that you can do? Is this the most that you can give? And that way, if my answer is yes, then I feel really good about my performance when I cross that finish line, and I don't have any of that hindsight, looking back, wondering if I could have achieved more, because I hear that a lot from athletes, like, ooh, I don't know, maybe I could have given more. It's just nice to know that you can cross that finish line feeling really confident that you gave it all you had. So I hope those tips helped you guys for pacing the half marathon. If you have other specific questions about the half marathon or videos you'd like to see, please place them in the comments. If you guys are interested in coaching or a customized plan, I will put a link below to our coaching page so you can see what our options are or reach out and ask. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one.